Welcome back everybody. In this episode, we run through the pros and cons of buying an SUV style four-wheel drive versus a dual cab ute. Because as you can see here, we've done a little bit of car shopping and we just took delivery of our brand new 2023.5 Ford Ranger Wildtrak. It's a V6 model of course, and I thought this would be a really good opportunity now that we've got both of them here in front of us to run through the pros and cons of each. Because up until recently, dual cab utes have been a little bit of a compromise, but they are very quickly closing that gap to a point where right now it makes it really hard to decide between the humble four-wheel drive or the dual cab ute. So in this episode, come along as we show you what it's all about. Now behind us here is our 2013 model Mitsubishi Pajero. Now it's getting a little bit long in the tooth, but really if you look at it, it doesn't look that much different to if you bought one off the showroom floor just a few years ago before they ceased production on these. The driveline in these is known to be one of the most reliable around, but that's not what this video is about. It's more about the practicality and things you might want to consider if you're looking to purchase a replacement vehicle or something to tow with and do all your normal family duties. And I also went through this process when we bought the Pajero because I was also looking at dual cab utes at the time. But really, you got so much more bang for your buck in an SUV style vehicle than you did with a dual cab ute of those times. Now they've come leaps and bounds to the point where this Ranger is awesome. Noting it is a dual cab ute, you wouldn't know it if you were driving it down the road. The suspension is nice and smooth, the interior is just like being in a passenger vehicle, and really there's not that many compromises you make if you go down the path of a dual cab ute versus an SUV in this day and age. So for us, this ticks a lot of boxes, but everyone's different. So let's run through what you need to consider if you're hunting around for a new tow vehicle that needs to do everything. Firstly, just like a caravan, you need to consider where you're going to park your vehicle. If it's inside a garage, dual cab utes are incredibly long and they're getting longer with every new generation that comes out. This Ranger is roughly 5.5 meters long from bull bar to tow ball, and it only just fits in our garage. We actually had to rearrange things so that this could squeeze in, as opposed to your Wagon variants, which are typically a little bit shorter. Now I think one of the most important considerations if you're looking at any vehicle or even a caravan is your payload. So traditionally your wagons or SUVs are going to have a lighter payload than your utes. And that is because they're typically made to carry heavy loads, and there's often a compromise there with the rear suspension to take those loads in regards to ride and handling. But again, they're slowly bridging the gap, and the modern ute these days isn't too bad. But there'll be a few things we'll touch on in regards to the suspension, brakes and all those sort of things that are different between the two, and things to look out for if you're looking between one of these two types of vehicles. But definitely look at your payload. So for example, the Pajero here has a total GCM, that is the vehicle and the caravan when you're towing it down the road, of around about 6 tonne. The Ranger increases that to 6.4 tonne. So you've got an extra 400 kilograms of overall payload difference between these two vehicles. Even though they're a similar size, the engines are a similar capacity and all that sort of thing. You really need to look at the payload and work out what you need to carry, and that comes down to how many occupants you have, how much you're going to put in the back of your four-wheel drive or your dual cab ute, and as well as all the towing bits and pieces that go into that to make sure the vehicle you choose will work with the setup you're trying to create. Really compare what comes in all the different vehicles you're looking at, particularly in the rear, because there's a lot of differences and compromises that can be made there. So I think it's really important these days to have air vents in the back to make sure the ventilation back here is really good for your occupants in the rear, which are normally your kids. You also want to have a few modern inclusions such as USB outlets and bits and pieces so they can charge devices when you're traveling around, just to make life a little bit easier. And all these things are included or aren't included in a number of different vehicles. The industry is becoming a little bit more standardized, but there are still vehicles around that don't have these rear air vents. For example, the Triton, that actually has this funny thing where it filters it and sends it from the front through the roof and back down. But you want to make sure it's nice and comfortable in the back, and the Utes are slowly catching up with that as well. As I said before, these Utes are getting a lot bigger. So the backseat space in most of the modern Utes isn't too bad. Unless you're a really tall adult, you need a little bit more leg room. But one thing to note, if you're looking at a dual cab Ute, and this is where the compromise comes in, is the back of the seat is typically a little bit more upright than a wagon or SUV variant. The other thing is that in a wagon, you can typically adjust these seats back to make it a little bit more comfortable on those long journeys. Compared to our old Bravo we had when I was a teenager, this thing is like a Rolls Royce. Interestingly though, wagons typically have more space in the second row behind the front seat, so you've got a lot more leg room as opposed to most typical Utes. And depending on what you're looking at, larger wagons are a lot wider, so you'll comfortably fit 3 people along the back seat. And that certainly comes into play if you've got younger kids and you've got child seats, because they take up a fair bit of room because they're quite bulky. So make sure if you've got to squeeze a few more bodies into the back that they'll actually fit. And obviously if you need to carry more than 5 people around, the wagons come into play because they'll quite often have a third row. Whether or not that's a 7-seat configuration with 2 in the back, some of them even have 3, but they get a little bit squeezy. Now there's a few considerations to make here if you're looking around for a wagon that has this third row, because there are quite a few differences. Traditionally you had the 2 seats that split fold and went up onto the side, like an old Toyota Prado or Land Cruiser or something like that, but that's generally disappeared. These days the seats either fold down into the boot like we have with this Pajero, or they fold down flat. But one compromise in the Pajero in particular is that this seat isn't a split fold. So if you want to put something in the back here, you have to have the seat up and either 1 or 2 occupants in the back. Now a lot of 4-wheel drives these days have these in a split fold configuration, so you can put 1 seat up individually and you've still got a ton of space down the side to fit a fridge, suitcases, luggage or anything like that. Obviously you're not going to have adults in the back here or older teenagers. They're generally going to be smaller kids because the back seat area is a little bit compromised in the third row. And I suppose from our point of view, we very rarely use these. And that was one of the decisions we had to make when we were hunting around for a vehicle. Because as I said, we looked at both the Patrol and the Ranger, because for us, they were ticking a lot of the boxes with a power point of view for towing. So you had the V6 in the Ranger or the V8 in the Patrol. Both of them are fantastic for towing. I can't afford a Land Cruiser, so that was discounted out straight away. And so for us it would be if we were taking 1 or 2 boys home for a sleepover on a Friday night or something like that. But in reality, if it came down to the crunch, we could just use 2 vehicles. I could just pick 1 or 2 of the boys up, and really for us that shouldn't have been a deciding factor given the compromises you'll see in an SUV versus the dual cab, which we want for our particular use. So have a think about that. And the other critical thing, if I fold this down, is to have a look at how they actually fold down into the floor. The Pajero is really, really good because the seat folds directly under the floor and doesn't impact on the boot area. In the MUX, for example, they tend to sit a little bit higher, which makes it a little bit harder and a bit more of a compromise trying to get heavy items into the boot area. And they sit a little bit higher on the back of the second row seat. In the Patrol, they actually fold down but have a very slight upward slope to that second row. So again, you don't have a real flat surface that you can put things on, particularly if you're wanting to build out the back or put some storage in. That makes it a little bit more difficult. There's a lot of solutions around for that, but they're just little things to consider if you're hunting around for a wagon. And that might make you decide between this or the huge amount of space you have in the tray of a dual cab Ute. There is just so much space for activities, not quite enough to sleep in, but it's pretty good. But on a more serious note, the dual cab Utes just offer so much more storage space than your typical or traditional SUV or 4-wheel drive. And it's fairly robust, whether or not it's got a liner, it's just a straight tub, you get a spray-in liner. There's so many different options and things you can do with a dual cab Ute if that's something what you're looking to do. So for us, we can shove green waste into here, we can put bags of cement, and I'm going to use this for a Ute. The one thing that you need to consider if you're using this as a daily, school runabout, doing the groceries and stuff like that, is that particularly if they've got a tub liner, things tend to slide around and they get lost and move around in the back of the ute. So for us, I've just put down a simple rubber liner, which actually does a fair bit. It stops things rolling around too much. The kids can put their school bags in the back, you can put your groceries and stuff like that. And they're actually getting quite smart with what they're doing with some of the offerings. So the Wildtrak tub liner, like a lot of people know, has a few little gimmicky things that are actually quite handy. Has little slots on either side where you can actually put a divider in. I'm going to do that just so we can split things up a little bit. I'm actually going to also make a false floor that will go in here for when we're doing camping trips. So in that, I can put a fridge slide on it, we can put our fridge in the back, battery, and organise a little bit better. From our accessory and being able to customise point of view, there's a lot more you can do with these utes these days than you can a typical four-wheel drive or SUV. So for us, we're going to migrate from a wagon because we do tend to use it for things that it's not made for. And you'll see through a few little episodes, I'm not going to do a full build series on this, that we might do a few little custom touches here and there to make it work in different applications. So as I said, this liner stays in here for most of the time. If we're collecting something that's a little bit dirty, you can easily take this out and the tub liner will get scratched up, but that doesn't really matter because that's what it's made for. If we're doing a little bit of touring, I do want to do a little bit of a fit out in here, and I'm kind of looking at the option of a tub rack at the moment. I just don't know. Or do we just bite the bullet? Even though it's a Wildtrak with the electronic roller shutter, I will probably consider pulling the roller shutter off and putting a full canopy in the back of it. Just have to see how we can use that. But there are a few compromises which I'll get into right now, and this is definitely something that I only really thought about on our trip, but particularly as we get into the warmer months, it's probably something to think about. And that is, if you've got a fridge in the back here, as opposed to a wagon, it doesn't get any air conditioning benefit from sitting in the back of your wagon like what we typically do when we're traveling and we've got the fridge in the back. So in here it gets incredibly hot. These aren't terribly waterproof, so you do get a little bit of moisture in here, and the dust egress, if you're on real fine dusty roads, isn't fantastic. So these are pretty harsh environment for anything soft that you're putting in the back here. So you can do things to seal them up. Obviously the canopy helps a lot and you can seal up all the little holes and penetrations in the tubs, but that's something to think about. If you're driving a lot of dirt roads, you'll end up with dust in the back here. Even with this Wildtrak, we've got the shutter and a little bit of a seal around the tailgate, they do get quite dusty and dirty inside. So as a result, if you're storing things that you'd normally have in the boot of your car or the back of your wagon, it's going to end up quite grotty. So that's another thing to think about. And now I guess that's where I'm leaning more towards putting a canopy on this so we can seal it all back up. But then we can't actually do things such as put a lot of the dirty and tall and ute sort of stuff in the back of it. It turns more into an extended wagon without the benefit of having it a full cooled space. The other big advantage of having a tub on the back of the ute is access to everything you've got stored in the back. As opposed to a wagon where you've only got that one point of entry, it's really hard to reach out the back, particularly with the Rangers where they have this little step. You can easily reach in, grab everything out, and it makes it a lot more flexible and adaptable to what your particular needs are. So for me, that's a little bit of a bonus. And obviously if you've got a canopy, you've got the lift up going doors that make access pretty much the same, that you can reach in, grab things from behind that you can't do with a wagon. So while we did go a Wildtrak, it's got these rails and stuff like that. You can put all sorts of trinkets on it, including having this really cool roller shutter, which opens and closes at a click of a button. That takes me on to another bit of a factor to consider, and that is security. Because on a modern style side ute these days, if you lock this, bump your central locking, everything is secure inside. No one can see what you've got stored in here, and it keeps things out of the eyes of people that are hunting around to break into your vehicle. Because with a wagon, you've obviously got the glass all the way around. And the compromise here is if you've got someone hunting around that's a little bit devious, they can peer in here, and if you haven't got things covered over, see what's stored in the back. It's quite easy to smash a window, grab it, run, and your stuff is gone. So from a security point of view, these are a little bit compromised, but there's obviously things you can do to make things a little bit more obscure or harder or less obvious for people if they're, opportunistic and hunting around to smash windows and break into the back of your four-wheel drive. The first thing would be to fit a drawer system and hide things out of view. But obviously the compromise with the wagon as opposed to the ute is that you've only got this one point of access. And while it is shorter, It is harder to reach back if you've got some big bulky things in front, such as a fridge or suitcases, which makes it a little bit of a compromise. Obviously you can get the Emu wings that replace the side windows in quite a number of popular four-wheel drives these days. That's a bit of a compromise, and it also affects your blind spots on the side. Now I'm a bit of a Wagon guy. I've had Wagons pretty much my whole entire life. My VK in the shed's a Wagon as well, and I really do like how versatile they are. One thing I forgot to mention when we were parked over there is that one huge advantage of a Wagon over a dual cab ute, because when it comes to long things they're kind of useless unless you've got roof racks and stuff like that, is that if you fold the seats down here you can fit some pretty long things in the back of pretty much any Wagon. Now the problem is, the nicer Wagon that you've got, the less you want to do that really, and you can see from all the little scratches and little witness marks in here. We tend to use this more as a ute than it probably should, but the one advantage obviously is that you can actually fit really, really long loads into a typical Wagon, or even my work van's good for that. Then you fit long lengths in here. You don't really have to worry about tying it down too much. Sit in here and you quickly get it home and do those little projects at home. So there's pros and cons with everything. This is just running through and raising a few little considerations if you're really sitting on that teeter-totter between a ute and a Wagon. Having all that access and amenity in a ute might sway you that way, but again, being able to have things in here fully air conditioned, cooled, heated and climatized is actually a really nice thing when you're traveling in the hot summer heat. It keeps the load off the fridge, keeps everything all nicey nice, but you obviously don't have as much space back here either. Now, one of the critical things to look at, particularly if you're towing or carrying heavy loads, is the rear end setup of the vehicle you're looking at. So there's typically two different styles of rear end differentials, and that's how the back wheels sort of work with each other. You either have a live rear axle in that the two rear wheels are connected by a beam and they move around like this, or you have an independent rear end. Now, independent rear ends are typically coil sprung. Now, the one advantage with a vehicle that has independent suspension in the rear, such as this Pajero here, or a Patrol, or something like that, is that they're a lot more comfortable to ride in. They've got coil springs in the back, and the two wheels in the rear work independently of each other. Now, if you're off-roading, there's a bit of an advantage there also, in that you don't have the pumpkin of the diff hanging down. You've actually got a lot more ground clearance. Now, the one compromise or consideration with an independent coil-sprung vehicle is that while they'll ride nice and comfortable, if you put a considerable amount of load or you're towing with them, they have a tendency to sag in the rear. And as opposed to a live axle vehicle where the wheels stay nice and straight, the back might come down, your tyre wear isn't such an issue, but it is something you definitely need to watch out for and address if you're towing with a vehicle that has an independent coil sprung rear end. You'll quite often see people will fit airbags like what we've done here with our Pajero, as well as stiffer springs to try to alleviate that, and then you can address little minor changes with a proper wheel alignment. It's not a deal breaker, but it's something to consider and something you might need to upgrade if you're looking at a vehicle that does have a softly sprung coil rear end with independent suspension, as opposed to something with a live rear. Even if it's soft, it'll just change the towing dynamics, but it won't excessively wear your tyres or anything like that. You'll also find the main difference between utes and four-wheel drives up until this point has been four-wheel drives will typically have four-wheel discs all the way around. And when I was hunting around to replace the Patrol, and I was considering the Pajero, Tritons, Hiluxes, Colorados and stuff like that, in the price point that you're looking at, that's one real compromise that you get. Because at that point, all those vehicles had like a real cheap rear end with a compromised leaf springs, they had drum brakes, and the SUVs or four-wheel drives were just so much more better value and bang for your buck considering what you pay for a dual cab ute, because they do have a bit of a premium, typically because they hold their value a little bit better as well. So while the Ranger is improved over previous models, there's a few little compromises over there which I'll run through now, and it's just another thing to consider if you're choosing between these two different types of vehicles. Now, the one improvement we're starting to see in the new generation of dual cab utes, or utes in general, is that they're being fitted with disc brakes on the rear end. And while drum brakes aren't really the end of the world, they're not that terrible, disc brakes are just so much more responsive. They're easy to keep clean and maintain, particularly if you're doing a lot of muddy or dirt driving, and they're just slightly better than having drum brakes. So that is a bonus that pretty much brings the dual cab utes in line with their SUV or four-wheel drive counterparts. That does make that point of difference a lot tighter and harder to work through. And I thought that would be why we should make this video, because the gap is closing up, and it's the little things that you need to think about that actually make quite a big difference. Now, a ute is still typically a leaf spring arrangement on the back with a live axle rear end. There are a few utes out there that do have coil springs, such as the Navara, but they have noticeably lighter payload. And that's why you'll see with the Raptor equivalent that it can only tow 2.5 tonne, because the coils aren't made to take the loads that the leaf springs typically provide. So if you're looking for a ute that's got that 3.5 tonne rated towing capacity, a payload of around about a tonne or just under, you're going to have a vehicle mostly that's got a leaf spring rear end. Now, where the compromise there, and it comes down to suspension tuning, which the Ranger does really well, is they'll typically ride a lot harsher when they're unloaded. As you load them up, they get a little bit better the more weight you put in there, but unloaded, they're typically a little bit more bumpy and not as comfortable to ride around in. And now Ford's addressed the ride and handling quite well, but the one compromise that comes along with that is because the ride's a little bit softer, when you do put a fair bit of weight in the back of these, for example, if you fully fit this out or you pull the tub off and put a canopy on it, they sag quite a lot. If you are loading them up, that might be something you look into, because it does change the dynamics of the vehicle. As the rear goes down, the front comes up, and actually a lot of the weight from the front gets redistributed to the back, and it puts it all out of balance. If you're towing a real heavy caravan, that's another result. It pulls the back down, and a lot of modern manufacturers don't like you using weight distribution bars. So they don't like using those torsion bars you put on the front of a caravan that cranks the back of the vehicle up and tries to distribute the weight forward. They don't like that because it puts a lot of strain on the chassis. So it's looking at a few upgrades you can do to the rear suspension to make that work better for you. And that mostly will come from a rear leaf upgrade. And obviously you update your shocks and stuff like that to suit. But generally a leaf sprung rear end will handle the weight a lot better than a coil sprung rear end. And that's just something to consider if you're looking at the two different vehicles. So it's just something to consider, and it goes on that bottom line if you're budgeting for a particular vehicle, and it's those little extras you need to outlay once you bought the vehicle to use it for its intended purpose. And I think that's where a lot of people get caught out. They buy a vehicle, but then they find, particularly with four-wheel drives and pretty much anything other than the Ranger, you've got to spend money on your brake controller, tow bar, upgraded rear suspension, all that sort of gear, and it does really add up. And now as the neighbours start up their pressure washer, I think one of the final points I want to go through are safety, quality and reliability. So again, standing around the front of the Ranger, these new vehicles have everything on them, and I think that's something you want to consider when you're looking at purchasing maybe a used vehicle versus a new vehicle. Here we've got 360-degree cameras, we've got sensors everywhere, blind spot assist, it'll adjust for your trailer or a caravan, you name it. But one of the most important things is it does also have all the radars on the front. And from that, there are two advantages. Firstly, you've obviously got the radar cruise control. So it'll monitor and keep up or slow down with the traffic as you're traveling along. To me, that's maybe a little bit of a luxury, but one thing it does have is a really good lane keeping assist. So if you're wandering across the lane, it'll just gently nudge you back in. And I think that is actually a really good safety feature. The other thing that comes with all these frontal sensors is obviously the collision protection as well. So if you do get into an instance where a kid runs out or someone runs out in front of you, or a car, a bit of livestock or something like that, the car will, the best it can, try to brake and avoid that collision for you. And I think that is something that's definitely worth considering, as opposed to the Pajero we've got over here that I would say is full analog. It doesn't have any safety features on it other than airbags and ABS. So there's no sensors, there's no computers, there's no wizardry that bring in the safety factors to help avoid a collision, keep you in the lane or anything like that. Now that will appeal to people, but there is the safety factor there that you need to consider, in that these aids have been brought in to make driving a lot safer. So I think that's something you might want to consider if you're looking at a previous generation as opposed to the newest generation of a particular vehicle or type. Just see what safety features it does have. Now obviously if you're looking at an older version, that does have some of that safety technology built into it, it's going to be a little bit clunky compared to the new stuff as well. So it's a real balancing act there, but I do think if you're looking at a newer vehicle, the more safety features it has will make your life a lot better and a lot safer as you're traveling around as well. And finally, I open the huge can of worms, which is quality and reliability. It pays to do your research, and it's really, really hard these days to actually do that research, because particularly with Facebook groups and stuff like that, a lot of the posts you see will be negative or little issues that people are trying to resolve. It's really hard to filter through those and find the positive against the negative. But one thing I will say is it pays to go and talk to a number of mechanics, body shops and stuff like that, or people you know that might be in the motor trade industry, to get their opinion. Now, I've got a fair few mates that are mechanics and they don't really like anything, to be honest. They'll say, no, don't buy that, don't buy that, don't buy that. But you'll start seeing a bit of a trend if you collate it all together. Now, for example, with Mitsubishi, there are noticeable difference between the models. So the Pajero here is the last of the generation, which is Japanese manufactured. And it's got actually quite thick paint compared to, say, a Mitsubishi Triton or a Pajero Sport. Now, they're little things that do add up, and you can't control them, but it's just something to consider. A lot of people do have issues with chipping on paint these days, and that's because more acrylic paints are being used. They're a lot thinner and they do have a tendency to chip. So then you start looking at, do you add in some ceramic protection, or do you get it wrapped or something like that? But the other thing is obviously the mechanical reliability of the vehicle that you're looking at. And that is where you can start getting some traction on common problems, reliability issues and stuff like that. And again, the Pajero has a bulletproof driveline. It's got the 4M41T, it's got the Aisin Auto, which is found in a lot of the Japanese makes, including Toyota and stuff like that. It really is hard to go past, but it's getting a little bit long in the tooth. The Ranger, on the other hand, has that blue Ford badge, and they don't have the best reputation around, particular with some of the early PX Rangers and stuff like that. 5-cylinder Rangers weren't all that good, and there's a lot of niggling issues that came with the 10-speed auto that was in the previous generation of this as well. But the 3-litre V6 has been used in the F-150 overseas. The 10-speed auto, which was co-developed between Ford and GM, has generally proved to be okay, and there are a number of upgrades that come in with this generation of the Ranger. So I have taken the risk in buying this, hoping and crossing all my fingers and toes that it holds together. But for me, it was obviously the V6, the power and torque that comes with that would be fantastic for towing. And obviously I was also looking at the Y62 Patrol. The driveline in that is pretty much bulletproof. And as opposed to all these modern diesels, it has nothing. It is just a naturally aspirated V8 engine. Yes, it uses a bit of fuel, but you don't have all those diesel injector issues. You don't have DPFs, you don't have AdBlue, you don't have anything. And that's one thing that does concern me with these modern diesels. There's so much emission control in them that there is that risk of things going wrong. But being a new vehicle, it's under warranty and it gets all those other lurks and perks that go with it that you don't typically get with a second-hand vehicle. So we've taken the risk, and so far I am blown away. It is awesome. It is such an incredible upgrade from the Pajero, even though I love the Pajero so much. But it's just something you need to look at and make those decisions. Once you're committed to it, that's pretty much it. So fingers crossed we have a pretty good run. And you know, the whole package of the Ranger really, really appealed to me. I just couldn't find anything, even the D-Max, it's okay, but it's still not great. The Triton's too underpowered, even though I love my Mitsubishis. Their incredible reliability and track record there. There are definitely things to look into, the quality, reliability and stuff like that. And that's something you don't get from a lot of the new vehicle reviews. They don't go into the long-term reliability or anything like that. You need to start looking into some of the second-hand reviews, jump into Facebook groups where the particular vehicle that you're down to 3 vehicles are, and have a bit of a trawl through there and just, you know, try to filter between a lot of the negativity you will see on any brand, make, manufacturer. So I think that's pretty much it. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a guide on things to look out for and really the differences between the two different types of vehicles, because obviously while they are getting closer, there are those noticeable functionality differences between the two. And it's something that probably a lot of people don't consider until they buy one, they start using them and they're like, this doesn't really work for me. So that's what these videos are all about, putting it out there, looking at the pros and cons, particularly while we've got the two vehicles here. It's the same as what we did with the Coromel. That's pretty much the same as our journey. We did a comparison between a pop-top bunk van and our Jayco Swan camper trailer. The pluses, the minuses, and just doing these reviews to help people out if they're looking to enter the market and they're not quite sure which direction to go in. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel. I've got a few little projects coming up, including a little surprise package that arrived from Royce at 3D Print RV. I'm going to drag the Swan out next weekend and do a little modification to the outside of it that I think a lot of people with camper trailers will be very interested in. It's definitely something that a lot of people comment about. So anyway, I thank you all for watching, and as I always say, get out there, stay safe, have fun, and we'll catch you next time.